Okay. Oh, give me a second, y'all. Okay. All right. So hello everyone. We are the book club. We don't really have an official name, but we are all here today to discuss this book here. Sorry, excuse all the tabs. So you want to talk about Race by Robin. I cannot say. I want to get her name correct.
Ijeoma Oluo.
Ijeoma Oluo. Yes. So Robin and I are like really excited that y'all are here. And we're going to jump straight in. We know that the views that we all have don't represent our entire race. It's just our own personal lived experiences. So we want to put that out there for those who are watching our dialogue take place. So Robin, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Okay. So we just wanted to start off with a quote that was in the book. And so this is the quote. "These conversations will never become easy, but they will become easier. They will never be painless, but they can lessen future pain. They will never be risk-free, but they will always be worth it." So we just wanted to start off the book club just with that quote, because I think it really sets the tone for what we want to do and the conversations that we want to have. And so, follow-up question with that, we just wanted to start it off with just an open-ended question for anybody to answer. What do you hope to get out of this book and this discussion? Like, why are you here, basically? Like, what are your goals or intentions?
Anyone want to start us off? I guess I'll start. So I think the goal of this, and when Robin and I first came together, is just for us to have a conversation about race. We know what's going on in the world. It seems pretty hectic and crazy right now, and there's a lot of tensions amongst people, people who identify differently than other people around them and within their own communities. And so really just bringing our lived and shared experiences together. So I hope to understand you all better, and I hope that you all understand me better as well.
Just bouncing off the diamond, I just hope to, really become more knowledgeable about other people's perspectives. I know I have my own perspectives, I have my own experiences, and so I hope that this book club, I'll be able to learn about other people's perspectives and experiences, and take what I've learned in this book club and use it when I'm talking with someone about race or about some of these topics, just so that I'll be able to have a meaningful, productive discussion.
I agree. I think to piggyback off of both of you all, again, I think learning about different experiences from different backgrounds, kind of around this book is definitely, a great opportunity. And I think in order for us to be able to educate other people and to be able to have conversations with other people, it'll be a benefit to us to learn from others. And I mean, this group right here, I know we all might have different experiences. We might all have like different living experiences that we face throughout our life. And so to center a book around dialogue and have these conversations and continue to learn about, what is race and how we can have these conversations about race are definitely going to be beneficial to our circles and to the people that we reach out each and every day, moving forward in the direction.
Absolutely. I think we can kind of all agree on that. I feel like there's something that we all hope and aspire to do. So with that, we'll jump into the book. I'm sure you all are ready to talk about it. So Robin and I wanted to start off with this thought-provoking statement, and it was a quote from the book. And for those who need context, the author was speaking about something that a friend had said to her during coffee that she didn't necessarily appreciate, but some may agree with this view. So we just want to get your thoughts on it. So we're going to start us off. The quote is, I just feel like we could have gotten further if we'd focused more on class than race. Surely, if you improve things for the lower classes, you improve things for minorities. Any thoughts about that statement?
I feel like it's a true statement. Like, of course, if you improve things for minorities or for the like a lower class, you're improving things for minorities because of like the systemic situation that we live in. A lot of our lower class is made up of minorities. However, I really liked the way that she addressed that comment and about how while that might be the case, there's more issues like involved and we have to address them kind of one by one. We should definitely address class, but race is another whole conversation and both need to be had. Right now we're having one more than the other, and I think that's okay.
Interesting. Any other thoughts on that? Someone who agrees, disagrees, wants to add into that statement?
Yeah,
I know.
I'll go ahead.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm sorry, I don't want to cut anyone off.
No, you're good. Go ahead. Go for it.
Okay. Yeah, so that statement was like so interesting and I think just huge to talk about because I think we're all in this place where we're trying to, with recent things that are going on in America, we're trying to figure out like how to tackle this bigger issue. And I think for the past couple of years, we've tried to figure out what's the best way to attack this head on. It's kind of taken a pandemic where we're all kind of slow and living our lives in very different ways where we're figuring out that, of course, race has always been an issue, but now we're really starting to see it rear its ugly head, I think, again, because we're all glued to our phones and we all see these different injustices that happen. And so when I think about any issue, like it's interesting for me, I always think about race as one of those first things. So in any type of issue that I encounter, whether it be like something technology based or something in the environment or something like that, I'm constantly, and maybe it's just because I'm a Black person, it's just what I think about a lot, but I'm constantly thinking about, okay, how does this affect Black people on a deeper issue? How does this affect my racial group on a more systemic level? And so that's something I'm constantly thinking about. And so for me, it's like when you ask about this question of race in class, I'm always thinking about race because it's just something I think that inherently covers so many bases. And that's the thing is like, we want to try to tackle so many different issues. And it's hard because there are thousands of institutions that need to be talked about and need to really have conversations about. But how do you even start with one? You know, there's so many different institutions that really need to be just upended in a lot of ways. And so I think that racial thing, just for me, I'm constantly thinking about it and constantly thinking about how's this affecting my people? Like, how's this affecting other people around me as well? So for me, the race always goes first.
It's something, it's very salient to your identity and also shapes your perspective and how you view the world. That's a salient part of your identity.
Building off what Thomas said, I think race is so.
We'll get you next. Sorry, go ahead.
Race is so like intertwined with American culture and all of our politics and society that any issue, even though it may appear as like a gender issue or, you know, a class issue on the surface, like race is always going to be involved. And so like the quote, like in the same section that I thought was really interesting was, what keeps a poor child in Appalachia poor is not the same thing that keeps a Black child in Chicago poor. And I think that's really interesting in the way it talked about trickle down social justice, because you can't treat all of those symptoms like with the same, you know, fix. Like you have to look at those issues from multiple perspectives and not just a class perspective or like not just a gender perspective.
Will?
Yeah, so Thomas, what you said made me think of a conversation I had the other day. And, you know, as a white person, I don't have to be conscious of my race most of the time. And that's something that's been something that I've thought a lot about in reading this book and in conversations in the last couple of weeks, is that, you know, there's a lot of blinders for me because I don't have to think about my race a lot. And one of the struggles for me has been learning to realize that just because something is not intentionally racist doesn't mean that it's not racist, or that sentence, but so it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And it, like, that's been a big struggle for me to learn to realize, and I'm obviously not anywhere near where I should be on that, but that's been something that your comment made me think of, and I've thought a lot about in reading this book.
Yeah, and one thing that Thomas brought up that was really interesting to me was kind of when he talked about how he's always thinking about race. And I'm like not a Black person myself, so I don't share that same experience, but I also think about race pretty frequently as a person of color, like living in the South especially. But I kind of found myself like not necessarily relating to, but seeing where the person who said that may have come from. Because for me, like I think about race frequently, but I don't necessarily think about class frequently, because I am in a place of privilege in the sense that my parents went to college and I never really had to worry about something like where my next meal is coming from. So I kind of like saw why the person might have said something like that. Like normally I feel like I would immediately like start, in defensive mode and, be like, well, why do you not think it's about race? But then that made me think about how for me, I don't think about class because I'm in a place of privilege.
I think you're okay. Volume down a little bit, and I think we should be good. It's okay. But no, that was a really good point that you made. And it seems like it's interesting because race in this country, it impacts us all differently. And we have so many different perspectives. And sometimes when we avoid these conversations, we miss out on hearing other people's perspectives and seeing that I myself, as a Black woman, I have my own lens to view the world out of, but someone else has their lens, and kind of seeing where we are disconnected with our experiences, but also where we relate. And so, yeah, those are really great things. Are there some other comments or things that we definitely want to make sure y'all have time, room to bring up your own thoughts or quotes or things that interest you all? Any other comments on that, questions, or want to move into the conversation?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, I think the thought process, oftentimes when you hear race and class and the relationship between the two, comes from the fact that like those are often like the two. I mean, there are other things, but those are often like two things that are fundamental in terms of how it shapes your life. And the one thing about it is though, with class, you can escape class, through climbing yourself through the ladders, climbing yourself up to the top. But race is something that you can never escape. You can be a billionaire and still, suffer from racism. Whereas if you grow up, poor and in poverty, there's a chance, you can escape. But the thing with race on top of that is, when it comes to class and escaping poverty, for example, race plays a role in it fundamentally shaping your prospects of being able to escape class. And so the two are often talked about as having a inseparable relationship, if you will, because one makes the other worse.
That's a really good point. And I think bringing that up, seeing how they're not always just two separate things, but they're often interwoven. That's really interesting. That's a really interesting point that you bring up. I think also the book talked about privilege a lot, and it kind of seems like this is where the conversation could be moving towards. And sometimes when we hear the word privilege, and I know Robin and I were talking about this, it can be, and I've talked to some of you about this as well, it can be kind of like it feels like an attack, because you look at race and you're like, my experiences are just as valid as the next person. Someone can identify however and feel that like I still have my identity in this world and my experience is valuable. But then there's this concept of privilege that seems to, for some people, may feel like it undermines their experience. And then for others, it's like this conversation of, it's not that we're blaming people for privilege, but we want people to acknowledge privilege. So can people, any of you, speak to privilege, speak to your own experiences of what you think that is, even if you find it to be offensive? Let's talk about it. Let's bring that to the floor. Let's kind of have that conversation about privilege. Anyone want to go first?
So I'll go again. So I've been having this conversation about privilege pretty frequently, I guess, in the past few weeks. And the one that really got me was I spoke with my uncle on the phone, and he is a very like political minded person, and we talk a lot about politics, and he has some different views than I do. And we had this conversation about how he was enraged that somebody could possibly tell him he had privilege. Like his parents, my grandparents, are immigrants. They didn't speak English when they first moved here. They, came overseas with $10 and, worked for every penny that they had, which is great. And it's a really hard thing to do, and it shouldn't be looked down upon in any way. But I was trying to explain to him the difference if he had a different skin color. And I was trying to do my best, and I was kind of trying to explain to him that, like, it's not his fault that he has privilege. He shouldn't be ashamed of himself, but he should be ashamed of the system that he has been allowed to take advantage of. And he's never had to kind of sit in a classroom and be the only person of color in the room. And he's never had to, it's a good thing I don't have to talk about this as saliently now, walk across a campus where the most iconic building on your campus is named after like a well-known racist person. And I think once I like kind of told him, it's not your fault, you don't have to like change who you are. You just have to look within yourself and be like, am I doing the right things? I should continue to do the right things and maybe step it up a little bit. He was like, okay, I kind of understand what privilege is now. Like, I don't think I really knew that before. I thought people were just telling me that I was bad because I was a white person. And I don't know how that narrative started. I don't know why people believe it, but it's really what truly people think white privilege means. And it's really scary. And I don't really know, I guess through these little conversations, we can like change the minds and like kind of create this better understanding of what privilege means. But like on a broader spectrum, I'm not sure how we do that as a society. So yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Any thoughts?
I think that's a very true, and like within my family and within especially other white people in my circles, is that when people hear privilege, they just think that it means that they were born with a silver spoon in their mouth and that everything's just been handed to them, which that's not true. And they can say demonstrably that that's not the case. But what I think is they know, at least on a subconscious level, is that things are easier for them because they are white. But that's, for whatever reason, that's not what's communicated by the term privilege. And I don't know how to, I guess, reclaim that term, or to make, if there's a better term, or like, it's just not what's being, people on the one level know that to be true, but that's not what the word communicates to a lot of people.
Do we think it's a defense mechanism? Do we think that it's just a misunderstanding? And I guess that can vary from person to person, because I think some people have mentioned, and I can even see that, is it's like a false narrative surrounding the word that prevents us from having meaningful conversations concerning privilege. I think I've even had conversations where the moment someone hears the word privilege, they're just like all out, just not, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to talk about it. So does anyone have an answer? And if not, that's fine, and we'll keep going, but maybe an idea as to why there's some level of, just not even in the people that we know. We don't want to speak about people we know, but it's in society as a whole, this idea of privilege and kind of, so we're not attacking anyone that we know, but just in society, there is a tension around that world. Does anyone think that we may have an idea of why, or anything that they want to add?
I think when you accept that you have privilege, it becomes really personal. And I think it is a defense mechanism, because if I can use a word that's not privilege, or if I can say something other than, if I can talk about it in some other way, then I don't have to own that it's me, Will Galloway, benefiting from this. And then I'm not invested in it. I don't have to defend myself. I don't feel emotionally drained by it.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's interesting.
I feel like people may also envision privilege as like ridiculous amounts of wealth and like the typical nuclear family. And a lot of people don't have that. A lot of non-Black people, a lot of non-people of color don't have that. And that is like the image that they create in their minds. And then when you tell them they have that, they want to like explain to you that no, they don't, and they've struggled too. They just don't understand the difference that that's supposed to call attention to.
I think it's super hard to educate people on like what privilege is, because everyone has privilege, and that's the thing. And like just the fact that we're sitting in a room with other college educated people shows our privilege right now. The fact that we have access to Zoom and things like that is even showing our privilege. And so it's almost I'm really deep, like trying to think in my mind, like how do we effectively educate people on what privilege is, so this isn't this just defensive tone when someone says you have white privilege, and you do, but like how to make that seem like you have 7 cars and different things like that. Just your skin color in itself gives you that privilege. And even me, like I can talk about privilege, we can all talk about our privileges. And so I don't know how we do that. Maybe it's trying to put that into education curriculums and have people teach that at an early age, and have it to a way where we can try to make it palatable for everyone, but also like any federal program is hard to do and try to make it palatable for everyone. So I don't know. But I'm privileged, the fact that I even had the access to learn about privilege. Like when I was an RA and I was doing that a couple of years ago, we had basically a whole section on it. So I don't know. That's a tough question.
Yeah. In the book on page 65, she writes, when we identify where our privilege intersects with somebody else's oppression, we'll find our opportunities to make real change. And it seems like before we can even get to combating the racial disparities in this country, we first have to look inward, and not just white people or, Black people, all people. No, it's all of us have to look inward to say, what privilege do I have? And what I thought was interesting in the book is that she didn't label it white privilege. She just labeled it privilege. And she also spoke from the perspective of Black people within our own circles having a certain level of privilege, even amongst ourselves. Thomas brought up a good point about, education, coming from a certain type of home or having a certain kind of support. There's privilege in that. So I think I think we can all kind of agree, it seems like, and I don't want to speak for anyone, so interject if you disagree, that privilege isn't a bad thing to have, but it's dangerous when we don't acknowledge it, because then we walk blindly in society, not recognizing how our privilege can negatively impact someone else. Mm-hmm.
I agree. I was just gonna say, I think the thing with privilege comes from like the visibility of it, because I think if we think like just from a historical perspective, obviously in the 50s, 60s, white privilege probably back then would have, well, not probably, it was easier to kind of just see off rip. It's not too much thinking you have to do about it. Today, when things are more structural and systemic, I think that makes it a little bit harder to kind of point out privilege. And I think it also gets back to the class and the race thing, because with class comes privilege, and with race comes privilege. Obviously, some races are not as privileged as others, and some classes are not as privileged as others. And so I think, for example, if you think in the context of like, say it was the 60s, and you have a white person that's poor and a Black person that's poor, a Black person having to, deal with the racial and the class component, kind of shows the privilege of the white person in that situation. But fast forward to today, and how like racism isn't, I guess, as brutal, I guess that's the best word to use, as it was back then. I think now, in the way we have to think about it from a structural and a systemic standpoint, and again, it kind of goes back to the history, is just thinking about the fact that these class and these race issues played a role in making it so over time, Blacks over time weren't able, to get certain jobs, weren't able to get certain political positions, to be able to, influence the government, how they would like from the inside, having to protest, so on and so forth, to get some sort of measures passed. And so I think when you think about that in the context of today, um, and we think about the systemic and structural problems, and we think about the history of Black folks not really being represented in government, I think that's one way to think about privilege, at least from a systemic and a structural standpoint. For so long, Black folks have not been able to participate in these spaces, and so now we're seeing the effects of these structures and these systems.
I That's a really good point. I think, and let's go deeper, because I think we're talking and we're having a really good conversation. And I love that you pointed out the obscurity of racism in a way. And I don't even know if I'm using the right word, but sometimes, I now speak for myself, sometimes when I'm talking to people about racism, even people that I love and people, who don't look like me but are my close friends, it's sometimes hard to have the conversation because it's sometimes hard to pinpoint. And Willie, you bring up a great point, because racism maybe back then was probably more blatant. It was more tangible. At one point we were enslaved in this country. Then you had Jim Crow. Then you were fighting for voting rights. And these were tangible changes. And now it's like we're in this system where it doesn't look like what we're fighting is tangible. It's like, well, and unfortunately, I've heard people say, well, you're free. You're not, which is so, I'm going to put this as my statement. I think that's a very ignorant view, because it really negates really what we're talking about when I have conversations with people, like, about what we'll be talking about. But some people have gone as far as say, like, slavery's gone, we're all great and we're dandy, or you can vote now, like, you're fine, just go vote it out and change what you want. And it's like, it's hard to describe. Well, I come from a line of people where I can actually pinpoint and not to say that others who are not Black can't, but I know a lot of people who are Black who weren't able to get an education. I'm the first in my like one of the first to even go to law school. My family, my mom was the first, and she doesn't mind me sharing this, one of the first in her family to get a college education. And that's more common, I'd say, and I can only speak for what I know, and my culture as a Black person. And so it's this idea that it's like we're fighting a system that we can no longer touch, but it's so ingrained in the systems that we have present. And it's like we're also in a way fighting an ideology, and fighting a mental thing. So if anyone wants to speak to that, I just, Willie and all of you have brought up some really great points. Anyone want to add to that?
I just wanted to follow up what you were saying, and just kind of like, I think a way to think about it is, like you said, you had slavery, you had Jim Crow, and you had those for hundreds of years. So when you think about, and also post Jim Crow, dealing with the resistance to ending the Jim Crow era, and so when you think about all of that, I mean, you go back as far as what, the 70s, maybe the early 80s. But when you think about like the long-term effects, when you enslave a race of people, when you subject a group of people to Jim Crow, and you don't allow them the economic opportunities to escape from poverty, just legally, and legally, again, you don't allow them opportunities to be able to have a voice for themselves in government. These things have long-term effects and generational effects. For example, just if we think about it from the economic standpoint, if both of your parents are denied the ability to get a particular job that they want, or they're definitely capped with the particular job that they can get because of their race, that has a generational effect on you. You're being held in poverty because of your race. Your parents aren't able to get a particular job because of their race. And this is real life, in the 60s, and in a lot of places, even in the 70s, into the 80s. And things like that have generational effects, like you were saying, with education, for example. Things like that, have an impact on whether a child would be able to have access to education or not. Because, for example, if you're in poverty, a lot of people, I know Fannie Lou Hamer, for example, she had to drop out of school and start working on a farm at the age of 12. And, when you get into the history of it, you see that this was the story for a lot of Black families. Um, and I don't know. I think we oftentimes think about Black history as more of a collective thing, and don't think about the individual effects that it had on families and the generational impact that had. And I think, like you said, I think we're dealing with a lot of those effects today, and that's why it's less visible because now when your parents aren't going to go get a job and being told they can't get the job because of their skin color and it being legal. So
Good point. Any comments, any fresh perspectives, even moments where, yeah, go Jacob, go for it.
Going off what you and Willie said about like sort of the invisibility of racism today, I think because you can't see it and because it's not so apparent, especially if you're not looking, it makes it a lot easier for white people to pretend it doesn't exist, especially when they don't want to have to, have those uncomfortable thoughts or have that burden on them emotionally. And as a white person who like tries to be an ally, it's really hard when I have conversations with my white friends in white spaces about racism and they don't even believe that racism exists. For the same things that you said earlier, it's like, oh well, slavery's over and you can vote now, so like, what are they whining about? And it's so frustrating, and I've talked about this with you, Diamond, before, like even when you're having conversations with people that want to learn and want to listen, which isn't always the case, a lot of people just don't want to learn and don't want to talk. But even when you are having a conversation with someone that has a good intentions and wants to learn, how do you start to explain systemic racism to a person that's never been exposed to it or experienced themselves? And like that's hard. Like where do you even start? Like there's hundreds of years of material to draw from. And I think that's like a hard thing that like I would say like allies would face, is that it's not like the conversations with your Black friends, it's the conversations like with your white friends in white spaces, and equipping yourself like with that knowledge to try to start to even explain hundreds and hundreds of years of problems, because a lot of people don't want to hear it.
Jacob, I think that's one of the benefits of when the book, when she was talking about the two different definitions of racism, that was helpful to me, because I think a lot of times it's easy for me as a white person to say, well, there's not, they're not, burning crosses or anything anymore. So it's easy to say, well, the visceral racism is much less frequent now, and since the systems that uphold that don't affect me, it's easy to dismiss that, which is why I thought I really liked the idea of not just saying something like, oh, that's a racist joke, don't say that, but saying that's a racist joke that perpetuates this stereotype that makes it tangibly more difficult for some people to get ahead in different industries or like that was very useful for me in thinking through some of those things.
I guess to
Yeah.
piggyback off of William, I wanted to just give that definition of racism because I really, learned a lot from that. So I think in the book it says the first definition that we always say is racism is any prejudice against someone because of their race. That's the general definition that you get. But the one that the author used was that racism is any prejudice against someone because of their race when those prejudices are reinforced by systems of power. So I feel like if we, shed the light in that way, because I feel that everybody knows systems of power in a sense. They know the things that dictate our lives on a daily basis as it pertains to education, as it pertains to healthcare, welfare, because financial, because you see that all the time in the news and everything. So if we could try to, format our conversations around that so people can understand. I think Jacob brought up a good point where, you have people that want to learn and you have people that want to figure this thing out. Because I mean, literally some people just don't know, or like have been like in their own bubble, in their own sense of, comfortability. And so you have people that want to learn. And what we have to do is, I know me as a teacher, like I try to find any single way to get that kid to learn that topic. And we have to, I think J. Cole said in his song yesterday, we have to treat, this like we're treating children. We have to show that love. We have to show that compassion. And we have to like meet them where they're at, in a sense of getting them to understand like how this thing is working, how this systemic racism has been going on for years and years now.
Yeah, and one thing that this made me, is my sound okay?
I think it's good now. Try
Okay.
it. Okay.
Okay, one thing this made me think of was kind of like the baseline to which we compare the progress that we've made. When you guys were saying that, people say like, oh, well, at least people aren't Black people aren't enslaved anymore. Like, that's like a horrible baseline to be comparing our progress to. And I think that's kind of what perpetuates a lot of these like ways of thinking. And I was once watching like a stand-up piece by Hassan Minaj, and I'm not like equating these things. I think it's just something that it made me think of. And he was talking about how once there was someone who like house when he was a kid, and he like called his family like a terrorist or something because they're Muslim, and he like threw a rock at his window and broke something. And anyway, so then his dad didn't yell back at the man, and he just started cleaning up the glass and didn't say anything. And Hassan was talking about how he was like so enraged, and he was like, why aren't you doing anything? Like, you need to say something. And his dad was just kind of like, well, like, we have a lot of privilege being in this country, like we don't need to say anything. And he kind of like accepted, this like baseline level of kind of just like existing in the world. And I think that's kind of the expectation people place on people of color, is to accept this like baseline level of freedom, this baseline level of respect, and just like pure like tolerance, not even like acceptance and inclusion. And we see this even when like universities talk about like retention of students of color. Like, we don't just need to retain students of color. Like, it kind of sounds like we're holding them like prisoners on campus until they graduate, and we're like, please don't leave. They need resources to not just stay on campus, but to flourish and to thrive and to genuinely have like a great experience. So I think that's just something that it made me think of, is we shouldn't have this expectation on people of color to accept such a horrible, level of progress, because the baseline that we're comparing it to is not where white people started, So I think when we compare where people started off, it's very different. And we need to really think about that actively as we think about the privileges that the rest of society has that people of color haven't had, and how much more work needs to be done for people of color to even reach where the rest of society is today because of these systemic disadvantages.
And I think Roanne brings up a wonderful point where I think I am at in this point where I'm just like, okay, I'll bring up two things. So at one point we're truly saying, like, when you look back at the 1960s of like that Jim Crow era, like it was illegal for Black people to enter into certain spaces. It was literally written into our laws. And I think when we start to say that out loud, we like really understand, like, wow, like that's kind of crazy. Like that was actually a thing. And now we're into 2020, and we're trying to figure out, okay, it was legal and like it's fine now, but that's not that long ago. And so how do we kind of find this emotional heart piece of trying to navigate what racism looks like, and how do we define systemic racism, like everyone is saying, to the entire world and to people that would never understand it. And to the second point, I would love to think I want to do it with love and with compassion. And that's usually the type of person I am. But also me personally, I've kind of hit a point where I'm just like, what if I don't want it to be palatable? I'm enraged. I'm a bit angry at a lot of things that are going on in this nation. And I think a lot of people have hit their breaking point of the love and compassion. And so just a little pushback, I guess, if you're a Black person in this in this nation and trying to figure out things. What if you don't want to make it palatable to people? And a lot of times I think about our working class people who this severely affects the most, but doesn't have the privilege to be in these college educated circles and know all these terms and stuff that we know. Those are people that are extremely angry at this point and want to know why I genuinely can't get that job, but this other white person can get it. How do we make that education palatable for them? I don't know, but I think it's something to be said.
Yeah.
Going off of
Oh, wait, I'm gonna go ahead, Madi. Sorry, Jacob, but Madi, go.
Sorry, Jacob. Well, like I've been, super upset and super angry, and it's been kind of tough to, talk about this topic and many more. But I think that, like I was watching a TED Talk by Renee Brown. I don't know if you guys have heard of her, but she just distinguished the term sympathy and empathy. And I think a lot of people right now, like they're willing to feel sympathy, like they're willing to feel for people. Like, I know you're going through this, I'll feel for you. And they're not willing to feel with people, which is totally different. That's empathy. It's trying to understand and trying to, stand by their side and trying to learn from their experiences, because you're not going to care until it's affected you personally. And I think that that's why a lot of people haven't, tried to learn more and educate themselves and try to support all the people and all the minorities here in this country.
Yeah. You all have brought up some really, really powerful things, and we're coming closer to a close. But I think that, it seems like we're ending in a good spot, because we're ending, and I say that you might think that's counterproductive, but we're ending with a lot of questions. And I think that that's good, because before we can move to fixing, we first have to understand. And we're starting with this idea of, I don't know your lived experiences, but I respect you. I'm thankful that you all are here to share, and I can learn, and we all can learn. But now it's kind of moving to the what. What are we going to do about it? And kind of further along, we'll continue to explore some things. In the next chapters, we talk about intersectionality, police brutality. Is it really about race? How can we talk about affirmative action? And what is the school to prison pipeline? So we're gonna get deeper into these conversations. And Robin, do you wanna chime in and say anything, or? No, can you hear me? Oh, I think you're muted. You're good.
But no, yeah, I just really like the way that the conversation went today. I think everybody had like really great points and insights. And so I think that, just in these upcoming weeks, it'll only get, better. And that we'll really be able to have that like fruitful dialogue and discussion that like we intended this to be. So I'm excited, and I thought that this was a really good first, discussion.
Yep.
I wish we could go longer.
I know, y'all.
I'm telling you.
We are super thankful for you all and everyone watching. I'm going to end recording.